It can seem a little hard to fathom now, but there was a time when Heavy Gear and the company behind it, Dreampod 9, were a big deal. And they are still going in a slightly more muted capacity, but by standards of role-playing games, Heavy Gear and Dreampod 9 have done remarkably well. There were computer games based on the property. There was an computer-animated children's series. The game, the property, did well. There are other properties perhaps less well, but Heavy Gear did very well indeed, occupying a similar space, I guess, to Battletech. And I really liked a lot of things about Heavy Gear and their other games such as Jovian Chronicles, Gear Krieg, and so on. But Heavy Gear was definitely the standout. It was familiar yet different. The system was good. It had a consistent look and appeal and artwork and a vision of a world that made it a good intellectual property. Now, the game itself takes place a long time in the future after a second ice age on Earth and then an exodus out to different planets all throughout the universe via jump ships. Now, this one takes place in a particular planetary system on a particular planet, Terra Nova, New Earth, which is mostly land with great lakes and a lot of rain. This comes into the way in which the technology and so on is developed, and it all makes sense within context. Earth is something that has been left far behind, though would be brought more into the game in the future as the Earth Empire, Alliance, whatever you want to call it, started to reach out into the universe and try to take back the planets that had been settled. Terra Nova was originally, if I remember correctly, a mining colony that had been kind of left to its own devices, left to survive, and the mecha that make up a large proportion of the whole setting of Heavy Gear were adapted from mining construction vehicles and so forth into military vehicles. So the colonies splintered and fractured into different factions and nations, and warred and built, and all kinds of new and different philosophies and ideas and so on began to spring up. One thing I always found particularly interesting in Heavy Gear was that they had a humanist nation that was slightly weird in the way it was organised, but showed a way in which a secular society can develop ideologies and issues the same as any others. Just the world building was top notch, and a huge part of that was the artwork, the consistency of vision and design. And given that virtually all the artwork, at least initially, was done by a single artist, Ghislaine Barbet, I think, a French-Canadian artist with a very distinctive style, little wonder. And that was a huge part of the appeal, the kind of pseudo-anime, French-influenced artistic appearance of the whole game was a huge part of what worked for it, and was a huge major selling point for it. He also did the artwork on their other game, Jovian Chronicles, which was more of a kind of normal mecha anime influenced game set in space in Earth's solar system. And there was always this tension between realism and action and fantasy in their games. They went too far the other way, I think, with Gear Krieg, which was a World War II game with mecha, but they took it too seriously. They didn't use the same artist, and while it was meant to be pulpy, the presentation of the material didn't match what they were going for, and so that didn't work. But in Heavy Gear, everything came together very well. The system in particular was very suited to this kind of game. It scales really well, so there is a smooth transition between tabletop RPG, skirmish wargame, and even up to larger like starship battles and so on, though that didn't happen so much in Heavy Gear. They do have things called land carriers, because the planet is mostly ground. They don't have aircraft carriers or that sort of thing, but the equivalent of these gigantic land ships that carry gears, their word for mecha, all around. But it was all very much rooted in, if not the completely scientifically accurate, at least in the plausible. The weapons made sense, the deadliness of the weapons often made sense, and the way in which things scaled just really worked, right from the low-level characters all the way up to the gigantic mecha. I did approach Dreampod 9 back in the day to license their system to power a rewrite of my Cloak of Steel game, which is a fantasy game with mecha and so forth. And we were about to sign the deal when the guy I was negotiating with apparently hadn't been particularly talking with anyone else, and they backed out. So that was unfortunate, but there's always retro-cloning or making up a new system with the strengths of this system, I suppose, if I ever get back to that project. But it was just definitely the world building that made this game work. Everything felt plausible, the nations felt plausible, the political tensions felt plausible, the technology, even the mecha, felt plausible. I mean, most of it wasn't the kind of towering stuff that you see in Battletech. It was stuff down at the human scale or a bit bigger that you could really see and think of, you know, trundling around and fighting and so forth. So it was very much focused and styled on the kind of military campaigns, military science fiction. You didn't have to play it that way, but it was never especially clear what else you would do. I mean, you could run sort of normal and cyberpunky and tech-noir and, you know, techno-thriller type stuff in the game setting, but then you would be foregoing some of the stuff that made it so appealing, the mecha. So even though I loved the game and the world and the design and the system and everything else about it, I never really managed to get a game off the ground, particularly, and ended up stopping buying the source books because there just wasn't much for me to do with it. I never got into the miniatures game because, well, I live quite isolated, and getting into any minis game turns out to be very expensive for very little return, and heavy gear was nothing really different there that would make me think any differently to that. And they are still going. You can still get the miniatures. You can still get the books online, so far as I know. I don't know how the war game does. Occasionally you see them being played at cons and so on. But it's the system that really made it, and you can get the generic version of the Silhouette system in ebook form online. But if you do see these banging around secondhand, or you want a good lesson in how to do world building in a really strong and effective way, and the value in a consistency of presentation with a good artist, then you could do worse than to pick up Heavy Gear or Jovian Chronicles. There are other games, not so much, but Heavy Gear, I'll always have a soft spot for it, and I'll always be looking for that chance to run a game that makes sense in this setting.
Monster misbehaving, planets needing saving, situations graven, I'll form the head. The enemy is clever, we're smaller but whatever. When we put it together, I'll form the head. Y'all can do the treading, swing energy machete. His combination's ready, I'll form the head. I'll form the head.